and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to present some of my research. And this is very much an active project for me. So I'd be very grateful for questions, challenges, objections, especially this is a really wide field of developmental psychology. And I'm only going to get into a few examples very briefly at the end. And so if people have some that are clearly things I've missed or just suggestions for other topics, that would be tremendously beneficial to me. So the topic is, why does developmental psychology matter for virtue? And my aim in this talk is to introduce and clarify some heuristics, that is like ways of inquiring and thinking developmentally or ontogenically about human flourishing and the cultivation of virtues. And in part, I want to address a little bit the question of how scientific research on developmental psychology can enrich and as well as impede human flourishing and the cultivation of virtue. And part of the background issue here too is to reflect on the way in which that this might provide something of an alternative way to discover the natural law. That's a side contention, not a contention I'm going to be focusing on, but it's something I want people to think about in the background, that drawing on some thinkers like Alasdair MacIntyre and a few others who've thought a little bit about the role of development for human, thinking about the cultivation of the virtues and the discovery of the natural law. This is perhaps a slightly different way of thinking about the natural law from traditional natural law, which is a kind of deductionist approach from the theoretical to the practical, and what's sometimes called new natural law, which is just basically starts from pure practical reasoning and works out the norms for practical action. And I apologize if you can hear my own little developing rational animal in the background, sometimes making some chatter. So the outline of my talk, I'm going to cover 3 different topics and get through them. And there's a lot of framing issues in the first one, and it has to do with how we should understand cultivating virtues and human flourishing. And then I want to think about the way in which, if we, from a common sense, that is everyday perspective, not in the philosophy seminar room or in academic research, just how do we think about the role of human development as just a fact? And how does this transform, as a matter of common sense, the way we think about cultivating virtues and pursuing human flourishing? And then in the third part, I want to talk a little bit about ways of scientific enrichments, challenges, and revisions to perhaps that common sense framework, and look at a few examples of, I think, really important insights that scientific theories in developmental psychology have, through experimentation and careful study, have revealed some insights that do transform our common sense conceptions of developmental psychology. Before I get into that, a few introductory remarks, maybe some clarification of terminology. The first is I'll sometimes be talking a little bit about operationalization. This is a technical term from the sciences. What a scientific study does is it operationalizes some concepts or conceptual framework in their experimental design and the ultimate interpretation of the results of some experiment. So what it means to operationalize is to take some concept like human emotion or human joy, human sorrow, human depression, or maybe fear, or take some concept like how long can a human retain something in memory, or the idea of maybe narrative memory and how long lasting is narrative memory, or maybe some concept of how do people practically reason about whether or not they should purchase some item or not? Are they very good with probabilistic reasoning? And what a scientist will do is take any of those concepts, and they need to find a way to operationalize them so that you could test them in an experiment. And it often implies figuring out a way that you could apply a quantificational or at least a standardized measurement to different things and try to control the relevant variables so there aren't extra confounding factors. Now, the reason why this is especially important in this sort of talk is we want to think carefully and critically about the influence or the help of developmental psychology for moral reasoning and practical reasoning. But one of the things that prudence needs to be careful about in reading the just sheer vast variety of literature, trying to help parents, trying to help educators, policymakers that are influenced by some of this research, is these scientific studies aren't operationalizing some neutral concept of human nature, some neutral concept of human motion, human desire, human reason, some neutral ethical norms. No matter what scientific study in developmental psychology or related fields you pick up, all of them are going to be operationalizing some conceptual framework having to do with human nature, having to do with human powers, capacities, ends, ethical norms. And many of them will be adopting conceptual frameworks that are rivals, or at least not wholly compatible or coherent from the point of view of a Thomistic or a neo-Aristotelian conception of human nature, emotions, practical reasoning. So in any study, we need to be able to think critically about the results and the concepts that were operationalized in the experiment and whether or not they need to be radically reinterpreted. So there might be something really valuable and insightful about the data or the results, but it often needs to be carefully and not naively appropriated and assimilated into a framework which we think we have independent reasons for committing. So we need to start with some conceptual clarity about human nature, ends, virtues, and human flourishing. And that's when I'm going to do some of the scene setting in the first part of the 3 parts of this talk. The second point that's important that I hinted at earlier is that unfortunately, there's been a real failure amongst philosophers and theologians to think developmentally about virtue and human flourishing. There's a tendency to automatically go to some conception of like a mature human adult, one that doesn't have any disabilities, and they provide the sort of paradigm for how we think about human flourishing and the nature of the virtues. And there's very little reflection theoretically, as well as attending to the experimental work on all the sort of processes that have to go into the cultivation of human flourishing and the cultivation of virtue. So that's going to be a key thing, sort of systematic of way of thinking about why, if we begin to think developmentally about virtue and human flourishing, is it going to transform some of our concepts, some of our ways of thinking about the virtues, but also importantly, thinking about the powers that the virtues are thought to perfect. At what stage do humans begin to develop practical reasoning and actually exercise it? But what are the progenitors or the proto forms of practical reasoning that need to be targeted and need to be educated in order for someone to develop proper, mature practical reasoning? And the same things with the kinds of desires, emotions, memories, and loves that we have, or at least proto versions of them. And the second part and third part, I want to focus on this distinction between common sense and scientific enrichments to our approaches to developmental psychology. So if we are going to be thinking developmentally about virtue and human flourishing, and by that thinking about how is this something that's aspirational or directional or a goal or a telos for infants, for children, for adolescents, maybe it's something that they're beginning to richly participate in, but also how do we think about people at the end of life and people who are aging, or maybe people who are suffering from dementia or Parkinson's? How do we think about human flourishing and virtue in those contexts? But also, how do we think about the obligations we have to each other and helping to nourish or cultivate virtues amongst each other in these different contexts? So when we begin to actually now step into common sense and scientific enrichments, we need to distinguish those two. We need to recognize that scientific and theoretical, including philosophy and theology as theoretical approaches or inquiries, how common sense is the source from them. We start thinking and being interested in prudence and practical reasoning because we engage in prudence and practical reasoning. We start being interested in how do we transform our desires or rightly align them because we have emotions and we have desires and they conflict with each other. So these scientific elaborations are always going to have their point of departure somewhere in common sense. But it's also important to recognize that scientific research influences institutions and the policies of these institutions, and these influence and transform common sense. And so we're not starting at this from sort of ground zero. We've all been subjected to over 100 years of policies and educational institutions that have been influenced by developmental psychology over the last 100 years. Piaget, Bowlby, Ainsworth, these sort of Montessori, these folks have had tremendous, enormous influence on the way in which education and the way in which pedagogy has been transformed for good and for bad in different ways throughout. So even now, our common sense reflections are already common sense reflections that have been transformed in significant ways, and in good ways that owe things to past discoveries and insights in scientific research. All right, so the first section, thinking about cultivating virtues and human flourishing. And here I have 4 points I want to talk about. I hope to some extent that some of this is familiar to a Thomistic or at least a Catholic audience that's thinking about this in a kind of neo-Aristotelian or Thomist way about human flourishing and the virtues. But I want to just frame things in a slight way to sort of prime us for thinking about these developmentally. First, I want to say something about human nature and flourishing. Second, about the ways that how we are transforming our different ways of practical reasoning. the transformation or transforming of our ways of desiring and loving, and the different virtues that are assigned to these two modes of transformation, and then how these are related to ideals and aspirations and the unity of the cardinal virtues. So first, a summary, a contentious one, but a summary of human nature and human flourishing. That's sort of the backdrop. This is the kind of concept of humans and human persons that, while they're probably not operationalized in most scientific experiments in developmental psychology, they're certainly what we need as Thomists to be developing or operationalizing in our interpretations of how certain scientific experiments have been conducted, how to interpret the results, maybe even how to interpret the limitations or some of the confounds of the operationalization of some of these experiments, things that they left out, to which Thomists are especially primed to notice. Now, roughly, we can define human persons in the Aristotelian Thomist traditions as developing and dependent rational animals. MacIntyre has done a lot. He has a book called Dependent Rational Animals to emphasize the role of social dependency, that we shouldn't think of rational animals as, atomic units, but they're deeply socially dependent on each other. And it's those dependency and social relationships that are required to help us to become relatively independent, practical reasoners and rational animals. What I want to add to MacIntyre's dependency is also emphasizing that we're developing dependent rational animals. So our social dependencies take on lots of different forms depending on the phases of development. Children depend extraordinarily on the adults and caretakers, family, parents. But as you become adolescents, you become more dependent on teachers and friends. As you become a young adult, you become increasingly more dependent on your peers and colleagues and friends. And as we age and get into our senescence, we become dependent perhaps on our children in interesting ways. And we have different kinds of dependencies due to the different stages of development. And the kinds of development and dependencies we have are constituted by an ontological integrated unity of different biological, psychological, personal, social, and spiritual factors. So from a Thomistic conception of the human person, we have to think in a complementary and integrated way to these different factors that are all hylomorphically constituted in a human being. For biological powers and their ends, we have things concerning life, nutrition, health, bodily integrity. Our psychological powers and ends include sensory perception, enactive motility, imagination, memory, various forms of imitation, emotions, desires, play, attachments. In terms of personal powers, we have especially intellectual ones that integrate these others, but also transcend them to some extent. Powers that have ends of wonder, love, normativity, both practical and theoretical forms of normativity, intellectual insight, rationality, intentional and voluntary actions. The kind of social powers and ends that we have are related to our different kinds of affiliation, family, friendship, different types of participatory communities, whether they be recreational, academic, religious, political. And then we also have spiritual existential powers and ends of our Weltanschauung, some sort of worldview. From an Aristotelian or Thomist point of view, we have the directedness towards eudaimonia or human flourishing, but also ultimate ends or meanings. And from a Thomist point of view, we also have grace that actually is important for the enhancement and the setting up of our ultimate end of perfecting our nature to an ultimate end of beatitude. So that's a very, very quick summary of a lot of factors, but this is the sort of conception of the human person that's important. And we need to then begin thinking about this not just in this matured way, where we have a fully formed human adult where all these factors are already built up together, but we need to think about this developmentally. And to think about it developmentally is to think about the different kinds of disabilities that can occur in any one of these phases, disabilities that are biological or psychological, personal, social, or spiritual in nature, the different kinds of interventions and the obligations we have to make those interventions when we learn about them or learn ways of overcoming them or moderating them or mediating them. Next, what's important is that all of us as humans, we all grow up to inherit traditions of various kinds that articulate forms of living well. So you grow up within a tradition that articulates the different ways of living well. And these different traditions of living well, a Catholic tradition, a Protestant tradition, a Muslim tradition, a secular tradition, And often us living in a secular age, we live in some sort of amalgamation of a number of these influences. But these different traditions of what it means to live well, what are the rules, the norms, the virtues, they're all going to address or fail to address these different factors and their potential unity or integration. These traditions are going to be comprised of a conglomeration of customs, of laws, of norms that pertain to our biology. So what are the norms or the customs for nutrition, for health, for hygiene? What are the norms and customs for psychology, for our personal well-being, for our social relationships, our spiritual activities? Within the Catholic tradition, especially the Thomist tradition, it emphasizes and tries to thematize the way in which there can be a unified integration of our biological, psychological, personal, social, and spiritual activities, that all of these are important, that they have a certain complementarity to each other, but it's also important to have the right rank ordering amongst these factors and ends. There needs to be a proper sort of subordination where spiritual ends are more important, but that doesn't mean that they eclipse, but rather that the biological and psychological, personal and social should find their proper place, even if they have an independent criteria for their evaluation and vindication, but they still find a kind of subordination to the ultimate end of beatitude. Of course, many rival traditions to the Catholic and Thomistic traditions tend towards kinds of monism, where they isolate one factor or maybe a couple factors as being totally explanatory. So if you think of kind of a biological reductionism, where I would say, well, really, it's biology that explains all of these factors. At the end of the day, the psychology or the personal or social levels are wholly explained by the biological. Or maybe a tradition that focuses entirely on sort of social constructivism, that all of this is socially constructed and just different rival views about human persons or natures is entirely due to what kind of social framework or milieu you come up in, and that's the whole entire story. Or you could even think of a kind of spiritualism or a kind of theologism that exaggerates the role of the theological to such extent that it denigrates our nature as biological, psychological, or personal. It doesn't seek any complementarity in them. And these would all sort of exclude the relevance of the reality of other factors that Thomists argue that are indispensable to a true understanding of human persons and human flourishings. Now, of course, I'm just sketching out these different kind of positions here. I'm not doing anything in this particular talk to try to vindicate or defend them, but just to sort of orient us in the kind of different views that one might have on these issues. So what we inherit in these different traditions, in doxa, as Aristotle calls them, are differently differentiated conglomerations, norms, virtues, laws, rules, customs, routines, and manners. So we don't set for ourselves the norms, virtues, laws, rules, customs, routines, and manners. We inherit them. We grow up within some parochial culture that already is living out everyday life with some set of norms which we inherit, some set of virtues, rival and conflicting conceptions of virtues, of laws, of rules, and customs. And what one hopes is that one's tradition helps articulate what's the point of each of them. What's the point of certain norms or virtues? What's the point of these laws or rules? And we can evaluate the success or failures of these traditions and their forms of education and their ability or inability to actually articulate what's the point. And we need to be able to ask questions concerning which of these norms or virtues or laws or rules or customs, routines or manners are truly contributing to human flourishing. Maybe something that's treated as a law or virtue really isn't something that's so generalizable or so has such heavy normative gravity. Maybe it's actually something more like a manner or a custom, something that's quite conventional and not something that should be sort of set in stone or taken as generalizable. Which of these are actually contributing to human flourishing, and which should perhaps be revised or rejected? There are lots of cultures that have systematically problematic or wrong-headed views about norms and virtues, and we need to call them into question and ask perhaps that these are in conflict with more fundamental virtues, more fundamental norms. But to ask such questions, what is the point of these, which are truly contributing to human flourishing, which should be revised or rejected, is to get us into the second part concerning the ways that we might transform our different forms of practical reasoning. How can we go about the transformation or the transforming of our ways of practical reasoning? And here I want to make 3 points. With respect to our inherited traditions of how to live, we need to distinguish what Robert Sokolowski and Alceder McIntyre distinguish as ends and purposes. Now, I don't have time to go into this, but This is a really important distinction that Sokolowski and McIntyre develop at length in various places. McIntyre has a YouTube lecture on ends and endings if one is interested, but that's also a number of their publications. But the point is that within this sort of milieu, this conglomeration of customs and rules, what we need to distinguish are genuine ends of our nature, ends of our social relationships, from our purposes, our wants. Now, sometimes our purposes and our wants align, but sometimes we have purposes that are in conflict with our ends. And so our ends, for instance, of perhaps being a good medical physician, might come into conflict with purposes of just pursuing career success, such that one begins to neglect the very activities that are oriented towards the very end of the medical profession and focus instead on the extrinsic purposes. Or one might be a very good doctor and actually their purposes and what they want in their pursuit of a practice line up with their ends. So with respect to these traditions we inherit, we need to distinguish the purposes of the social views from the ends of those social practices, but also our own purposes from our ends with our participation in them. We also then need to be able to distinguish what are genuine norms from things that are just customs and manners. And we need to make distinctions within all of this from natural law and positive law. And McIntyre and Sokolowski argue that this distinction between ends and purposes is what guides us and leads us to the discovery of things that are genuinely constitutives of the natural law. We also need to distinguish common ends, common goods, from individual and individual goods, and their proper rank ordering, the way in which common goods, shareable goods, allow us to pursue our individual ends and that these aren't at odds with each other. Second, it's important to realize that even though I've described this in a very individualistic way, in a very individualistic manner, all of these questions and all the ways in which we ask these questions about, is this someone I should be friends with, or is this not someone I should be friends with? Is this a course of study that I should pursue for my life? Is this a trip that I should go on? Is this a place that I should move to or live in? Is this a job that I should take? All of these are questions that we ask in very importantly shared participatory ways where we engage in social interactions with our friends and our family. So it's very important to see the role of social dependencies and shared participatory critical inquiries, that we ask these critical questions about our traditions, not alone, but with others. And some traditions foster this developmentally much better than others, that they ask from early stages. So John Paul II spends quite a bit of time at the beginning of Fides et Ratio discussing the differences between cultures and traditions that ask these questions about their traditions. Are they true? Are these norms true? Should we live according to them? From those that don't ask questions, that just accept them and move on with things. The other way then that we relate to reasoning well is our reasoning well in all these different factors is done through the transformation of reasoning by the cultivation of prudence, prudentia for nisus. And of course, this is a complicated doctrine in Aquinas, but there are 3 points we need to highlight. One is, of course, prudence is that reasoning well where we try to pursue the right means or subordinated ends between different excesses and deficiencies with respect to the ends that we're pursuing. And this, Aquinas says, occurs in 3 ways. Prudence needs to be perfected by deliberating well. He calls this the virtue of eubulia. We need to make good decisions, both in ordinary and extraordinary circumstances. So we need to cultivate good decision-making. This involves synesis and gnome, but we also need to act well. We need to act on our good decisions and good deliberations. And this is the principal act of prudence for Aquinas. We also need to recognize the many ways in which we engage in practical reasoning. We engage in practical reasoning prior to acting. And this is sort of the paradigmatic way in which people think about practical reasoning, where we plan some action out or we deliberate with ourselves or with others about how to pursue some action. But it's also important to see that we can engage in practical reasoning in the here and now, where it's not something we necessarily articulate linguistically, but it's something rather articulated in our very bodily actions. A lot of things in life don't involve the time to sit back and deliberate carefully. A lot of the most important heroic or vicious acts occur in the time with serious social pressures or group pressures to conform and do one thing or another thing, and where we decide to lie or not lie, where we decide to stand up for the truth or cower and not say anything in some particular circumstance. And those are also important moments of practical reasoning. And third, practical reasoning also occurs in a retrospective way, where we reflect critically on why did I act in this way? I might have done the right thing, but I did it for the wrong intention. Or I had the right intention, but it was in the wrong circumstances. And the practice of examination of conscience, and an early discipline of this, is of course crucial for a long-term life of reflecting retrospectively on how do I transform and improve maybe my reasoning, maybe my desires to desire the good reasons better. So these are a number of different ways that are all bound up together in Aquinas' conception of prudence, the virtue that perfects and transforms the ways in which we practical reason. We also importantly need to transform our ways of desiring and loving. And this pertains to the other virtues, the moral virtues, virtues like justice, temperance, and fortitude or courage. So we need to transform our desires and loves so that they conform to these ends and activities comprising human flourishing, these ends that are specified by practical reasoning. So we not just need to be the kind of person that has good practical reasoning, but we need to be the kind of people that are motivated to act in accordance with our practical reasoning. This, of course, concerns justice and the common good, temperance and desires concerning pleasurable, enjoyable, painful, and sorrowful goods and bads, as well as courage, which transforms our desires concerning arduous or difficult goods and bads. Now, a key thing here for Aquinas is related to that these virtues are need to be united, and they have a complementarity to them. This is an important but controversial doctrine in Aquinas and Aristotle. Among acquired and diffused virtues, Aquinas distinguishes between imperfect and perfect realizations of the virtues, and this perfection and imperfection is related to their unity of the virtues, or their lack thereof. One kind of slogan way of putting the unity, the connection of the virtues is that if you have prudence, you have to have all the others. So if you have one virtue, you need to have all of them. Now, this seems problematic. It seems that many of us might have a little bit of courage, but we certainly don't have justice, or we certainly don't have fortitude. And this is part of what Aquinas' view is about imperfect virtues and the way in which we need to distinguish these from sort of natural aptitudes. So someone who just naturally finds it easy to be brave, but isn't someone who's actually has properly the virtue of courage. One thing that's important to realize here is that we can be cultivating the virtues in terms of the sort of aspiration towards the virtues. And what we're aspiring towards is the ideal unity of them. And so there's an important developmental way in which we can think about the unity of virtues, that there's an aspirational way in which we can be cultivating them imperfectly with the aim of ultimately uniting them. Okay, so that's my sort of general framework of a very complex framework of sort of how we need to approach developmental psychology. Now, the important thing is that seeing that this is in the background, it makes it much easier to then think, well, what are all the interventions and how might I rethink or reconceptualize that what I hope is a pretty standard and justifiable presentation of a Thomist virtue, natural law, ethic. So what I want to do now in the second part is, and third part, is focus on the ways in which developmental psychology can transform that, that enhances it, that elaborates it, doesn't undermine it, it just offers modifications to it. So the first point I want to talk about is just the fact that Aristotle draws our attention to how important it is to have the right kind of childhood, the right kind of upbringing that prepares us such that when we get to a certain age, we can actually be influenced in good ways by moral theory, but also, of course, the ways in which we could be influenced well by developmental psychology and the sciences. This, of course, relies on good parenting. And as McIntyre points out, all of us are imperfectly educated because we had imperfect educators. And those imperfect educators, our parents, our teachers, our family, our friends, were themselves imperfectly educated. And so we need to kind of set a balance here, both the realization of these imperfections, the recognition of the ways in which we can transcend them, but also not to set sort of stultifying ideals. And McIntyre draws our attention to the importance of the work of Donald Winnicott, who worked a lot on child psychiatry and introduced this very well-known phrase of being a good enough mother, a good enough father. And so our aspirations need to be appropriate to practical reasoning and prudence, seeking to be good enough and an aspirational way that seeks to go beyond that. So with that in mind, think about these four features of the way in which development, thinking developmentally about virtue formation, quite radically transforms the earlier picture. The first one is that flourishing and virtues are developmentally indexed. What I mean is that we need to think about human flourishing and the virtues, not just human flourishing as defined as a certain kind of mature state of life, but that would exclude or neglect the way in which infants can be flourishing, children at a kind of toddler to childhood age might be flourishing, that adolescents might be flourishing, and that even adults in their senescence can be flourishing. Just because they can't engage in philosophical discourse, endlessly, doesn't mean that there's not relevant forms of human flourishing and relevant ways to think about the virtues with respect to them, either as developing the virtues or already realizing them in imperfect ways that are heading up towards us others. So I think this is the first sort of really major, quite radical modification and enhancement to the standard conception of human eudaimonia and human flourishing, is that we need to recognize that there are types of biological, psychological, personal, social, and even spiritual modes of flourishing that can occur in infancy and childhood and adolescence, and that the model for them is not the model of a mature adult. We need to think about the kinds of friendships and the kinds of adult child relationships of adolescents, of smaller children, of infants, and those are going to be very different, and those norms are going to be quite particularized to those different indexed developmental phases. And likewise with individuals, adults in their senescence, we need to think about the way in which they can be genuinely flourishing in a way that doesn't actually hit some paradigm or doesn't meet with some conception of just the mature contemplative philosopher. So that itself, I think, is a pretty radical claim, which helps us to rethink through what are the developmental stages leading to prudence in an adolescent versus a younger child? What are the developmental stages of thinking about fortitude or courage in childhood versus adolescence versus young adulthood? But another factor, if we're thinking about this developmentally, is that we're not going to do it in a way that sort of encapsulates and isolates. There's just the flourishing of 6 to 9-year-olds, and then there's the flourishing of 10 to 13-year-olds, and then there's the flourishing of later teenagers. What we need to recognize is, because they're developmental, is that they do have developmental phases of flourishing and virtue formation or virtue realization that are differently, but also that the earlier stages are aspirational to later developmental stages. So we need to evaluate them both as what is the flourishing of an adolescent, both given the kind of phase of life they're at, the kind of friendships they have, the kind of opportunities and institutions that are available for them, but also to evaluate that phase of flourishing as aspirational, as directed towards the cultivation of prudence, of justice, and so forth. A fourth factor, and here again, there's already been a lot of psychological research. So even though I'm saying this is sort of an aspect of common sense, that you don't need to be a scientist to be thinking about good enough parenting, to be thinking about these kinds of developmental conceptions of flourishing or virtues or aspiration. You don't need to be a developmental psychologist to know about scaffolding, even though this has been something that has come from developmental psychology and has radically transformed and influenced the way that we think about developmental psychology. And scaffolding helps us think about the ways in which people who don't actively exercise practical reasoning, but sort of can extrinsically participate in it. So children, as well as adults that are aging, especially adults that are aging that are suffering from dementia or Parkinson's, they still can participate in the practical reasoning of the community around them. So scaffolding, the metaphor here implies the sort of building up, or if not building up, sustaining or supporting, maybe perhaps the loss of practical reasoning. So what we need to think about in terms of developmental aspirational approaches to child flourishing and virtues is we need to think about the ways in which adults can be helping children, setting up the scaffolding so that children have desires to respect rules and right authority, so that children are forming and being cultivated in the desires that are scaffolding to respect reason giving that's directed to the ends of rules and virtues. So not only do we teach children rules and to respect authority. But we also try to teach them when they begin to ask why questions to the capacity that they can understand it. What's the end and the point of rule following? What's the end and the point of authority? Such that they begin to be able to distinguish for themselves mere purposes or wants of rules and authority from the proper ends, so that they can distinguish bad rules from good rules, good authority from bad authority. If we deprive them of the thinking and giving reasons with respect to the ends of rules, of virtues, of authority, we deprive them of their ability to critically reflect on, to transform, to modify, and to discriminate between good rules and bad rules, good authority and bad authority. But we not only need to teach them and give them the scaffolding where they can have desires to pursue and give reasons and ask questions and seek good answers, distinguish them, but also to distinguish and pursue good reasons over bad reasons, okay? And I started here and highlighted desires here because this is really pointing to the kind of affectivity. It's before the children really can engage and exercise this practical reasoning of themselves, but already through imitation and through routine, through discipline, they can learn and begin to transform their desires and affections to be inclined towards these. And this is meant to fill out Aristotle's claims about why a proper upbringing and a proper childhood is so essential. And it's about the scaffolding, the kind of proper flourishing at the different developmental stages of their appetites for reason giving, such that when they come into their own, when they don't need the scaffolding to the same extent, then they will be able to appreciate this reason giving. They will already desire this reason giving, and they'll be able to make these discriminations amongst themselves. The other reason why, I'll come back to that. There are, of course, other important insights and developments that have occurred. Michael Tomasello has written so much, and he has a recent book on human becoming, which is very helpful, and it covers a lot of important issues about human ontogeny, the role of joint attention, joint intentionality, common activities, the role of the personal. But Tomasello is one of these important developmental psychologists who's operationalizing something kind of like a contractarian conception of normativity, not a proper virtue theory. So even though the data and the results of his, some 3-4 decades of research are invaluable, nevertheless, it's operationalizing a sort of normative framework to which an Aristotelian or Thomist needs to be critical about. There's, of course, also important roles of imitation of children and different types of moral exemplars. And these are the exemplars and narratives and the television shows and the kinds of friendships that they have and other relationships. And it's really important to be able to ask children from an early age and continue to ask them questions about why are these good or bad exemplars? Why are these good kinds of friendships or bad kinds of friendships, such that they begin to desire the right kind of exemplars and desire the right kinds of friendships. There's, of course, a lot more we could say about this, but my point here is that it doesn't take a scientist to have to make these discoveries. And of course, we've been influenced by scientific research in developmental psychology to some extent in highlighting these. But these are ways in which just everyday practitioners, everyday people of common sense can integrate this into the way they think about the virtues and the way in which they've transformed their practical reasoning to pay attention to these different aspects having to do with virtue and flourishing. In this final section, I want to just briefly mention, very, very quickly, 4 important insights that I think have come from scientific inquiry and enrichments of developmental psychology. There's sort of an endless variety of ways of examples we could look at. The first major one is attachment theory, principally through the work of John Bowlby and Ainsworth, who focused on and discovered, drawing on work that had been done with animals and different kinds of attachment that had occurred. They began to find more about children and the different kinds of attachments developmentally that they have to different caregivers, especially their parents. And Ainsworth in particular distinguished between secure and anxious, avoidant, and types of disordered forms of attachment. And since then, this has been generalized sometimes to bad effect, but sometimes, or most of the time, I hope to good effect across adulthood, in the ways in which we have secure types of attachment, where we can have relative forms of autonomy, where we feel comfortable with our relationship and our security with, and our dependency with caregivers or other adults or friends or family or spouses, and different problematic ones where the relationship is problematic in ways in which it's inconsistent. And so we have rather anxious sorts of attachment, whereas other kinds, it's so disordered that and so problematic, so negligent that we develop forms of avoidance of attachment. So these are sorts of cases of children or others who just avoid others or just sort of indifferent to others that are around them. These forms of attachment are crucial for thinking about human flourishing at different stages, and it's done a lot to transform both educational theory and can do a lot to transform the way in which we think about the virtues. Of course, attachment theory is focused on certain kinds of developmental disorders, but it's also the sciences that has drawn our attention to the autism spectrum disorder, various forms of attention deficit disorder. There's just endless lists of important developmental disorders that if it hadn't been through clinical research, they wouldn't have been brought to our attention, and interventions that could facilitate these disabilities or disorders that are now available that parents have access to that have radically transformed common sense. A third way has to do a lot, again, with this feature of scaffolding, and that focuses on what we've discovered from clinical settings and others with dementia patients and Parkinson patients, is that oftentimes a diagnosis for some of these forms of dementia are so late because it doesn't occur until after perhaps an elderly couple's spouse has passed away, and then that spouse is the individual, the widow, is on their own, and they fall off very, very quickly, and others around them hadn't noticed all the deficits that had been developing, that they probably had been suffering from dementia for a long time. And part of what has happened is their spouse who's passed away provided a sort of secure scaffolding for them to engage in routines and a kind of discipline that held their life together, that they could continue to participate in the kind of practical reasoning and the flourishing of the activities that are around them. What this insight of discovering how important scaffolding and routines are for the continued intelligibility and flourishing of people who are suffering from types of dementia is there have been a lot of care facilities that have failed to focus on this factor, that there have been a lot of care facilities that tend to just take dementia patients and place them in the corner and not attend to them and not allow for them to have a kind of stable scaffolding and a kind of continued form of life and flourishing, where you take over and you don't let them feed themselves, even though it might require great patience to allow them to still have this. That scaffolding is something that's important for them to continue to have these daily routines. And when you remove that scaffolding, they deteriorate very, very quickly. And so people like Julian Hughes and a number of other people who work on dementia and old aging have really focused on the importance of person-centered care, where we keep these scaffoldings in place, where we try to keep these social, interpersonal factors in place, and they help sustain the personal, the psychological, and the biological in rather extraordinary ways. The last point I want to make is something that is actually more of a deleterious effect of developmental psychology. People who work in marketing and people who work in tech, especially Silicon Valley types, they've done a lot of work hiring developmental psychologists and developmental neuroscientists to teach them a lot of things about human memory, human attention, human motivation, and the ways that this developmental psychology can be used and unfortunately exploited for marketing and for technological purposes, the ways in which you can make children very early on into long-term consumers who are, if not addicted, at least deeply committed and have deep habits of different types of routines that keep them from asking critical reasoning kinds of questions, that keep them from acting the kind of practical reasoning questions that I had mentioned before. And so, one way one might teach a moral philosophy class is to look at the curriculum of a marketing course that deploys developmental psychology and is essentially trying to use developmental psychology to exploit liabilities and weaknesses in the human condition so that they can be manipulated and biased towards, from a Thomist point of view, vice. What we should do is look at those syllabi and actually think about those and teach our students all the ways in which they might bias themselves towards virtue, that they might recognize and appreciate developmentally the ways in which they've been exploited and manipulated by developmental psychology that's been used in these ways. And they might try to critically reflect instead about ways in which they could bias children and others towards virtue, that we could use the same research for good ends rather than ways of manipulating us. Now, I briefly just want to conclude with a few rules of thumb here, that ways in which we might try to evaluate this research. How do we distinguish the good from the bad? How do we look at the developmental science and try to make critical appropriations of it? How do we think critically about the operationalization? Well, the first is we need a pretty robust view about truth. Truth, of course, for a Thomist means the conformity of our understanding to reality, that our understanding and our grasp of these things actually conforms to the way reality is. But we also need to appreciate a kind of fallibilism. We need to recognize that if things were different, we would have to make revisions to our account. And so we need to recognize, of course, these scientific studies are prone to all sorts of fallibilities, and there's all sorts of confounds. So we need to think critically about how the science was conducted, how large the sample size is, what are the control conditions. We also need to be well aware of the replication crisis in the psychological sciences. This is a very important thing that I don't have time to go into, but if you're unfamiliar with it, I highly recommend you check it out, because one of the important things we just started discovering in the early 2010s is that many of the most important studies in psychology, including developmental psychology, haven't been replicated, that they were underpowered studies, and this is an enormous crisis. Part of the reason why this happened is because there was a lack of sociological self-knowledge. What McIntyre means by this is that even though we might recognize that we're fallible, because of our own selection biases, we're going to be inclined to try to just read from certain kinds of views that are accommodating to our own point of view. What sociological self-knowledge does is it allows us to reflect on the limitations and the kind of parochialism of the things we read, of the kind of objections we're unlikely to take seriously, but some of those objections might be the very ones that lead us to the falsification of some of our deepest commitments. Another important feature about truth is we need to think about, if we're committed to something as truth, does it have any pathological liabilities? Charles Taylor introduces the idea that modern individualism is a kind of pathological liability of the ethics of authenticity, the ethics of being authentic and finding that truth about oneself. He suggests that that kind of insight of the ethics of authenticity can go in a pathological direction if we lose the good parts about the ethics of authenticity and focus instead on simply the individual and the individual's desires. And so an important question we need to ask about any of these theoretical approaches is, are the pathologies just due to incidental misunderstandings, or are they somehow actually systemic? And does that raise us questions or maybe needing to revise our commitments to some particular view? We need to be careful, secondly, about fadism. There's, of course, a lot of fadism in developmental psychology. One of the fadisms of attachment theory is attachment parenting, which has sort of exaggerated some of the more important controlled claims about attachment to sort of, a type of excessive form of attachment that gets very extreme, both of forms of extreme disattachment or excessive forms of attachment. So we need to be careful about that. And related to the fadism is often a kind of panacea monism, where we think of one particular thing, like development, as if development is going to solve all of our problems, or attachment, as if that's going to solve all of our problems, or maybe it's imitation or narrativity, as if this one factor is going to solve everything. So those are the kind of major rules of thumb that I think we need to use those sort of heuristics to think critically about how we're appropriating and how we're looking at the operationalization of different sort of scientific concepts and how they have influenced or could influence our ways of thinking about developmental psychology. All right, so I packed a lot in there. I hope that this was stimulating and interesting. I'm certainly open to objections and would appreciate any questions. And yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some of my research here today.
Great, thank you very much, Daniel. It was exciting and really brings a number of questions. So I'll see how much time we will have and how many of them I will be able to read. So first, there's one question from one of the listeners who says this. So what would you say from a spiritual point of view about how to approach virtue building in people with psychological problems, because you've mentioned that, such as poor attachment or personality disorders, or even with mental disabilities. So what can we expect realistically regarding flourishing in people who are not fully psychologically and cognitively healthy?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, a very difficult question. One of the things I think that this developmental science and clinical research shows is it helps us to actually understand better some of those disabilities and what their limitations are. But also, a lot of it has helped us think about ways that we can make genuine interventions. Some of them are radical and quite transformative. Others, of course, are just quite limited. And I think the important point here is that, yeah, I think if I caught the underlining tone of the question, is that some of them are not going to be that much, but that helps us to have actually much more realistic conceptions of what flourishing looks like for children with such severe, and what kind of lives and flourishing could be for them. But we need to think, of course, creatively and imaginatively about it as well. It helps us also recognize, as McIntyre points out, the tremendous sort of dependency that they are going to have on us, and the role that we need to play as giving them voice and speaking as their proxies and the kinds of needs that they have. So it might be the case that they can't have something that looks like proper fortitude or proper prudence. But what we can recognize are the kinds of ways in which we need to have fortitude or patience in dealing with these very difficult situations, and the ways in which we can try to recognize what does flourishing look like for this severely disabled child, this severely disabled adult, and not rule that out from the get-go because we have some excessively maturist or ableist conception of what human flourishing is. So part of the point I'm making here is not only are we need to think developmentally about flourishing for an adolescent without disabilities, but we need to think about what is flourishing for a child who will have chronic or perpetual disabilities. So there's a lot more packed into that very, very important question. But I hope that that's a little bit helpful of the kind of direction that I'm going in.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So now I have two questions that are more general. So first comes from Caroline, who asks, whether you have any recommendations to read more about how a parent can apply scaffolding during the development of their kids. And I guess a similar question coming from Jessica, who says, do you have any book recommendations for Catholic school teachers to help them better understand developmental psychology?
Those are both great questions. I wish I would have come armed with a little bit better thoughts about them. Now, there's an important book, I think, called The Life Project, that's on some 70-year study of development in human development in Britain, where they looked at, it's one of the largest cohort studies of developmental factors that lead to, if not flourishing, at least better lives. That's a helpful book. All of these, I want to make the point though that, from a Catholic or a Thomist point of view, you're likely going to have to critically appropriate the material. That what's been operationalized are often conflicting or different norms. I'm not sure how helpful this book would be for a parent, but Michael Tomasello's Human Becoming is a really, really important book about a lot of the work on scaffolding, on joint intentionality, joint and communal intentionality. Jennifer Greenwood has a great book. Also, a lot of these books are called Becoming Human or Human Becoming. And hers is really on the issue of scaffolding. Greenwood has written a lot about scaffolding and emotionality and children's. And I think that book's probably relatively accessible. There's this recent book that's been done by Craig Titus Stevens and others on Catholic a meta-personal approach, a Catholic meta-personal approach to human psychology and human persons. It's something like that. And there's a lot of good articles in there that could be helpful. I have actually a few friends at Steubenville who are thinking about writing a book related to helping parents for thinking about some of these developmental and other issues and thinking about the importance of moral exemplars. And I imagine they're going to cover scuffling, but I don't want to, I've given you probably enough of a hint of who, maybe where this book might be coming from, but I don't want to commit them to that. I'm trying to think of some other examples. I mean, I do think McIntyre's Dependent Rational Animals, the second half is all about this sort of issues, which was really the kind of book that got me interested in a number of these topics. A number of work that's engaged with positive psychology. Someone who's a friend of the Thomistic Institute is Christian Christiansen, who works in the Jubilee Center for Character Formation and Virtues at the University of Birmingham. He's not necessarily written explicitly on developmental psychology, but on positive psychology, as in the sense of psychology of developing a sort of positive cultivation of positive emotions and positive thoughts. He's written critically and helpfully about that. And then, I mean, frankly, going back to Donald Winnicott, he's fantastic. And Winnicott did all of these BBC recordings where he talked about good enough parenting and good enough parents. And I remember at the beginning of the pandemic when my daughter was only a few months old, and I remember listening to a lot of these, which McIntyre recommends. You can go and find them, I think, on the BBC archive, like all of these recordings that are about, 10 to 20 minutes, and there's a whole series of them that are quite interesting and important for features having to do with development. And then finally, Jerome Bruner, who wrote quite a bit about some of these issues and also some on scaffolding. Bruner was an important clinical and developmental psychologist who wrote a lot about meaning and narrativity and importance for child development. So I hope those are both, if not helpful for parents, some of them would be helpful for Catholic school teachers. And I mean, I hope that I'm writing a monograph on some of this coming up. Whether it's helpful for non-academics is something to be seen, but I aim to make it a book that is so.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next question, these are again two questions. They will come from me and one of the listeners, and they this time will do with the methodology. So the question you've mentioned about this operationalizing tendency that we, as I understood, correct me if I'm wrong, that is predominant in the non-Thomistic circles working on developmental psychology. So the question would be, are we as Aristotelian Thomistic scholars afraid of it, or we are behind and we should engage it, or should we be critical about it and the extent to which it is used? And is it necessarily reductionistic or not necessarily reductionist? Okay, this is one thing. And I think it corresponds to the question that also was asked by one of the listeners who says, I think within the same strain, but more practically. So how can, I mean, whether there can be a correspondence here and how much we can get from secular psychology, since knowing what a healthy human is necessary to treat unhealthy humans, and secular culture has very conflicting views of what is human. And I think you also mentioned about that. So on the more practical level, because of methodological approach, whether there is hope and space for cooperation between different schools of psychology.
Yeah, those are two excellent questions and issues. Let me start with the second one first. So I think we do need to be very cautious and careful and, reflective about this. I mentioned the fact that, Tomasello is basically adopting a kind of either contract theory or contractarianist conception of normativity. So when he thinks both about the evolution of human morality, and then when he thinks about when human moral reasoning begins to occur in human development, he's looking for when can there be shared consensus or shared agreement. But from a Thomist point of view, there's already a whole range of things that are involved normativity way before that, and proper ethical activity. And so we do need to read them with some critical attention and reflection. And I think one of the great things that's helpful about someone like Christian Christensen's work is criticisms of positive psychology that Catholics might, from a lot of different perspectives, whether it's in education or parenting, they might pick up some of these well-known trade backs books. and positive psychology, and they might just think, oh, this is great, this is wonderful, they're talking about human happiness and these sorts of things. But human happiness in those discussions is often entirely defined in terms of pure subjective reporting or desire satisfaction, which is, from a Catholic point of view, totally inadequate. And so we do need to be very cautious and critical about how we reflect on these findings and discoveries. On the other hand, we also think that nature is pretty resilient, and it's not going to be entirely missed by psychological and scientific research that's done well. Really careful psychological research has overcome and overturned things that turned out to be just dead ends. Behaviorism ran aground with actual human reality, actual animal reality, that behaviorism wasn't an adequate methodological or theoretical conception of how human and animal behavior functions. Focuses too much on human autonomy and human individualism have also run aground. And there's been a lot of important psychological research to show how communal and how important they are. So I think that it's right to be suspicious, but on the other hand, if we're realists about human nature and human psychology, we're going to see, it might take some time, but we're going to see ways in which pathologies actually come out in different kinds of psychological research. And it will take a lot of sifting. There's not going to be easy to find material. But I think it is going to be the case that we can find real value and real truth in a lot of these studies, because we're committed to a kind of realism, or at least a kind of critical realism about nature is going to disclose itself, even if we're trying to push back against it in ways that it doesn't want to go. The second point is, I think we need to, again, balance with respect to sort of operationalization. One of the worries about why this might be a kind of reductionism is that maybe some of these factors just don't admit of quantification. Maybe we just can't quantify the virtues very well. Maybe we can't run a good metric of them. Maybe there's so much social contingency that to try to give universalized laws about them, universal quantified ways of thinking about courage or fortitude, maybe these are just overly reductionistic, and whatever results we're going to get is going to be somehow a kind of diminishment of what the real factor is. I think in some sense that kind of critique is right, but only partially right. I mean, again, it's not as if we can't quantify these to some extent, that we can develop some probabilistic and statistical or different kinds of social models of these things. The problem becomes where we think that the positive experimental results tell the whole story. And so what we need to do is look at the plenty of psychologists and social scientists who realize that these quantificational methods are indispensable, but they're also quite limited. So we need to be careful about and learn from and read more from the sort of psychologists and social scientists who recognize and are critical about the limitations of their methods, that we need to quantify in order to operationalize. But only so much data is also useful, and any of these attempts to quantify are going to be, to some extent, an experiment is always going to be a little bit ecologically invalid. If you've ever been in an MRI machine, you know that it's this pounding, super loud machine. So how much are you really learning about prayer or decision-making in the brain in an MRI situation when they're having to hear this loud sounds or when there's this tunnel? It's not exactly what we call ecologically valid. So there's a lot of good philosophy of science and a lot of good scientists who reflect critically. And not all of them think that when you operationalize, you're getting everything into the funnel. They realized that they had to cut certain things in order to operationalize and quantify and run the sort of experiments they do. So again, you need to be discriminating and make discernment. So I don't think it's an exclusively reductionist method, but it is true that some people can run with it in that way, and people have.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So I hope we'll have time for maybe two short questions and hopefully short answers. The first one comes from Don, who says, simply, what is the place for grace in like those models that you would like to develop within this research?
So I mentioned grace, but I mentioned there to show the theologians that I know that what they do is more important than what I do. But I don't have, I don't have any intentions in specifically making that a crucial part of my own research. As a Catholic and as a Thomist, I recognize grace perfects our nature. but my own particular research isn't focused entirely on this. But that means an important point of recognizing grace and recognizing supernatural ends is recognizing the sort of fundamental incompleteness of whatever we want to say theoretically or even practically about any of these factors. So one of the points of a Thomist model, philosophically speaking, is recognizing the conclusion of how incomplete all of this is, that there aren't questions that can be answered entirely by philosophy or by psychology or developmental things. And that, one of the important points of grace is recognizing that a lot of good relationships, a lot of good parenting, a lot of good friendships, a lot of recovery from bad friendships, from bad relationship, from bad parenting is only achieved existentially because of grace. So that's an ongoing kind of recognition, but it's not particularly something that I worked on. A colleague of mine, Jeremy Wilkins, wrote something on grace and growth a number of years ago that did focus a lot on these things, drawing a lot on the insights of Bernard Lonergan. There's, of course, a lot of work that has done this. Again, that volume I mentioned with Craig Titus Stephen, I apologize if I'm misremembering the order of his names. This meta model for a Catholic approach to human, they're going to talk about some of these issues to do with grace. So there's other people that are doing that kind of work, but I have to confess, as a philosopher, I don't get into these sorts of work, this sort of issues too much.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last question is coming from Father Thomas Davenport.
I think, unfortunately, maybe you might have a similar answer to what you just asked there, because in some ways I wanted to ask something that's a bit of the flip side of what the previous question was, not so much how, it's related to the question of grace, but from a pastoral side of, and something that maybe your own reading and research might have to offer. Are there any particular implications of the research in developmental psychology that you think can aid in pastoral work in the context of, for pastors and priests who, particularly in my own head, I'm thinking of it, questions coming in the confessional, questions coming in these things, but particularly the way of how a better understanding of good working, but also, just developmentally abnormal. So people with developmental difficulties, those who are aging, is there understanding the human aspect of that in order to better understand the pastoral need for, when there is, questions in the confessional, whether there are questions of intention and will, how much, there is, habituation and addiction, things like that. I mean, are there aspects of that you think have been addressed, or things that have been missed by a lot of sort of pastoral or be valuable for pastoral situations?
Yeah, so I of course can't comment on the well, maybe I could, but I don't know enough, so I won't, of whether they've been missed. But I think absolutely some of this has already been integrated, and we already expect so much of our priests. But unfortunately, one of the things that they do probably need to learn, and obviously part of their formation is some of this, is the importance of learning about these developmental phases. And that would be important pastorally for informing parents that they're expecting too much of children, or they're not, or maybe they're not doing enough, or they're, in a way. I should have mentioned earlier, but Julian Hughes, who I mentioned briefly, he's written both popularly and academically a lot about aging. And so if you want to think, I know people are asking more about children and development, but Julian Hughes has written a lot practically about policy stuff. He's a Catholic author too, so he's written a lot about these sort of things, and they're important. So pastorally, there's going to be important things of understanding and recognizing psychiatric disorders to some extent, to recognizing what we can expect developmentally, both for teaching parents and educators, but also for when we have some of those children that we're encountering and how we can try to help them and think through them. But also to ask them the kind of questions that are inclining them aspirationally towards different kinds of virtues and practical reasoning. And then also pastorally for dealing with children who are adults who have aging parents, and how should they be thinking about their responsibilities. We have a really horrible culture just in general of what we think about how we should be helping our parents. In part are the jobs. I mean, most of us now live so far away from the communities that we were brought up in. And so that, we feel like we don't have those responsibilities, or sometimes they are impossible. And so all of our elderly family members and parents end up in special care homes or nursing homes rather than our own homes. So I think pastorally, people need to think, when it's possible, much more constructively about what their obligations are for caring for just aging parents, not necessarily, or relatives, not necessarily ones who are suffering from dementia, or if they are, think about the roles of scaffolding and these sorts of issues for those things. And Julian Hughes has really written really well, I think, on these issues from a kind of public policy in a practical way, as well as in a more academic context and setting. So, yeah, I suppose, my answer is yes, of course. There are a lot of helpful things that are available here. And some, of course, has. I mean, as I'm sure many of you had in your experience, that there is quite a bit better awareness of the importance of informing priests in their formation of these kinds of psychological disorders and other things to be aware of.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you very much once again, Daniel, for this wonderful lecture. I believe it was very, very inspirational for all of us who listened to it. I would like to thank all of those who joined us tonight. Please share the information about our series. You can watch previous lectures on our website, and please invite your friends and peers and colleagues to the next lecture, which will take place on May 17th. And it will be the lecture delivered by Jonathan Lunin of Cornell University. And the title of the lecture is Search for Alien Life in the Solar System, the Science and Theological Implications. So once again, thank you for joining us tonight. God bless you. May your further celebration of Easter be wonderful and peaceful. And please, once again, join us next month.